Search warrant. Open the door. Show your hands. Those words echoed through the desert property, but it wasn't just the law enforcement officers' voices that mattered. It was the question that followed, the one that would haunt investigators for months. Do you have any sympathy, any regret for what you've done? And the answer? Truthfully, no. Tonight on Minds of Murderers, we tell the story of a young veteran seeking a fresh start, 2 men he trusted, and a betrayal that turned friendship into murder. This is the story of Matthew McLaclin, a man whose life ended in the most unimaginable way in the deserts of New Mexico. If you want to follow every shocking detail of this case, hit that subscribe button now and turn on notifications, because every twist, every revelation matters. Now let's begin. In July 2025, 23-year-old Rainer Joyner, an active-duty soldier stationed at Fort Benning, walked away from his military post. He didn't file paperwork. He didn't request leave. He simply vanished. And he wasn't alone. His roommate and close friend, 22-year-old David Degro, deserted alongside him. The 2 men packed up and drove nearly 1,400 miles west to Joyner's family property in rural New Mexico, near the small community of Tres Piedras. But before heading there, they made one critical stop. Virginia. That's where 22-year-old Matthew McLaclin was living. Unlike Joyner and Degro, Matthew had already completed his military service and been honorably discharged. But life after the Army hadn't been easy. Friends say he struggled with addiction. He struggled with stability. And he struggled with finding direction. When Joyner and Degro offered him a chance to leave Virginia behind and start over out west, Matthew saw hope. A new environment. New space. Distance from old habits. It's a new start, he reportedly told friends. So he packed up and went with them. At first, everything seemed normal. Matthew even made a brief trip to Colorado to handle matters related to the VA. He returned to New Mexico shortly after. And then suddenly the calls stopped. Texts went unanswered. Social media went quiet. No updates. No explanations. For Matthew's family, the silence felt wrong. This wasn't like him. By July 31st, the worry turned into action. His mother filed a missing persons report. Refusing to wait for answers, she rented a car and drove across the country herself from Virginia to New Mexico, hoping to find her son. She told investigators exactly who he had been staying with: Rainer Joyner and David Degro. 2 men he trusted. 2 men who had promised him a fresh start. At that point, authorities weren't just looking for a missing veteran. They were now looking at 2 military deserters connected to his disappearance. And the timeline was tightening. Because whatever happened to Matthew McLaclin, it happened in the desert. And someone knew the truth. By mid-August, investigators had 2 urgent problems on their hands. First, a missing Army veteran whose phone had gone silent. Second, 2 active-duty soldiers who had deserted the military and were now tied to that disappearance. On August 17th, law enforcement moved in. Officers executed a search warrant at Joyner's family property near Tres Piedras, New Mexico. The land was remote, dry terrain, scattered trees, long stretches of open road. The kind of place where sound carries, but witnesses don't. As deputies approached the house, they announced themselves loudly. Search warrant. Open the door. There was no response. Inside, the home was empty. No Matthew. No Joyner. No Degro. But investigators didn't walk away empty-handed. They found military-issued gear. Duffel bag, rifle magazines, ammunition. Enough to raise concern, but not enough to answer the one question that mattered. Where was Matthew McLaclin? With desertion warrants already active, authorities coordinated with the U.S. military to track Joyner and Degro. The search didn't last long. Soon, the 2 men were located. Officers approached cautiously, aware that weapons had been found at the property. When confronted, Joyner and Degro exited their vehicle slowly, hands raised, walking toward armed law enforcement. They were detained without gunfire. At that moment, the focus was still military desertion. But that was about to change. Because once Joyner and Degro were separated and questioned, investigators began pressing harder about Matthew. Why wasn't he with them? When had they last seen him? Why hadn't anyone heard from him in weeks? The answers were vague. inconsistent, and detectives could feel it. This wasn't a simple missing persons case anymore. Something had happened out there in the desert. Something final. By the time the sun set that evening, Joyner and Degro were sitting in interrogation rooms, and investigators were preparing to hear a story they weren't ready for. Inside the interrogation room, the atmosphere shifted. Detectives placed a blank sheet of paper in front of Raynard Joyner and slipped pen across the table. Write everything they instructed. From the beginning. Every detail. What Joyner put on that page would transform the case from a missing persons investigation into a homicide. In his written statement, Joyner described a confrontation on July 25th. He claimed he approached Matthew along a path near the property to address what he called rumors, drug use, and repeated disrespect. According to Joyner, tensions had been building for weeks. He wrote that he was in a dark state of mind. Then he admitted he shot Matthew with an AR-style rifle. He described dragging the body away from the road and into a wooded area. And then, almost unbelievably, he returned to work the very next day, as if nothing had happened. Investigators were struck not just by the admission, but by the tone. There was no panic in his words, no visible emotion. The statement read as controlled, direct, detached. In the days that followed, Joyner purchased supplies, buckets, heavy-duty trash bags, a splitting axe. He explained that the terrain made burial difficult. The soil was rocky, hard to dig. So he made another decision. Matthew's body remained exposed in the summer heat before Joyner began cutting it apart. In questioning, he described the process matter-of-factly, as if discussing a task rather than a life. When detectives asked why he didn't simply call authorities, why he didn't walk away, why he didn't choose any other option, his answer was blunt. He believed Matthew had been given enough chances. He said he did not regret what he had done. Not then. Not now. For investigators, the confession clarified the crime, but it raised a new question. Was this truly a sudden act of anger? Or had it been planned all along? While Raynard Joyner described the shooting as a confrontation that spiraled out of control, David Degro told investigators something far more calculated. According to Degro, this wasn't sudden. It wasn't heat of the moment. It had been discussed before. Degro claimed Joyner had talked about killing Matthew for weeks leading up to July 25th. He described multiple conversations where Joyner expressed anger over rumors, drug use, and what he saw as disrespect on his property. But the conversations didn't stop at complaints. Degro alleged that Joyner floated different plans, different methods. At one point, he supposedly considered shooting Matthew from a distance with a .308 rifle. Another version involved ambushing him along the road leading up to the house. The final plan, Degro said, changed when Matthew's movement shifted. On the day of the killing, Degro claimed Joyner armed himself with both a rifle and a handgun and positioned himself in concealment. Degro said he was instructed to walk normally to stay visible and to make noise so Joyner would know exactly when Matthew was approaching. Then, as Matthew walked up the road with groceries, a shot rang out. Panic followed. Degro told investigators that Joyner emerged and fired additional shots at close range. Afterward, Degro said he was threatened. "You're helping me," Joyner allegedly told him. "Or you're next." Degro claimed fear kept him silent. He said he believed Joyner was capable of killing again if he refused to cooperate. Investigators would later hear that Joyner instructed Degro to assist in handling the remains, allegedly to ensure shared involvement and eliminate the risk of him becoming a loose end. Control. Pressure. Intimidation. Two men in the same event, but two very different narratives. One describing rage, the other describing a plan. For detectives, the distinction mattered. Because if this was premeditated, it wasn't just murder. It was execution. After the confession, investigators needed more than words. They needed locations. Raynard Joyner eventually agreed to take authorities to the sites where he had discarded Matthew's remains. The drive led them to remote stretches along U.S. Route 64, isolated areas where traffic was sparse and the terrain unforgiving. According to Joyner, the rocky ground made burial nearly impossible. He told detectives the soil was packed with volcanic rock. Digging would have taken hours. maybe days. So he chose another method. He purchased heavy-duty trash bags, plastic buckets, an axe. Over the course of several days, he separated the remains and placed them into bags. Some were left miles apart from others. The idea, investigators believed, was to make discovery less likely and identification more difficult. When asked directly why he chose to dismember the body, Joyner's explanation was disturbingly practical. It made the most sense. Not panic, not fear, not remorse, just logistics. Detectives combed through the areas he identified, recovering what they could. The desert heat had already accelerated decomposition. Wildlife had interfered in places. It was a grim, methodical search. The more investigators learned, the clearer the picture became. This was not an impulsive attempt to hide a mistake. It was a sustained effort to erase a person. And yet, even as evidence mounted, one thing remained striking about Joyner's demeanor. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't shaken. He wasn't apologetic. If anything, he appeared resolved. For detectives, that calmness was as unsettling as the crime itself. Because disposing of evidence is one thing, but carrying it out over days, while going to work, while speaking normally, while acting as though nothing happened, that suggested something colder, something deliberate. And investigators were about to confront him with a final question that had lingered since the beginning. By this stage, detectives had pieced together the full scope of the crime. Matthew McLaclin was dead. His body had been dismembered and scattered across remote desert sites. And the two men he had trusted, Rainer Joyner and David Degro, had played active roles in both the killing and disposal. Investigators confronted Joyner directly. "You served together," they asked. "You brought him here. You set him up. You killed him. You cut him apart. Do you feel any regret?" The answer was chillingly calm. No. Joyner claimed that Matthew wasn't the same man he once knew, that the man he had given chances to had disappointed him repeatedly. He described the act as necessary, almost routine, an execution of someone he believed had overstepped boundaries. Even in the face of the horror, Joyner expressed no remorse. To him, it wasn't murder. It wasn't tragedy. It was simply a problem he solved. Detectives also learned that Degro had been coerced into assisting. According to his statements, Joyner threatened him, insisting he help handle the body, warning that refusal could make him the next victim. Control. Manipulation. Cold calculation. It was a reminder that in cases like this, violence isn't always chaotic or emotional. Sometimes it's premeditated. And sometimes it comes from someone who once called you brother. With the confession, evidence from the property, and the recovered remains, authorities moved quickly to press charges. Rainer Joyner, 23, now faced multiple counts. First-degree murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, aggravated battery, assault with intent to commit a violent felony, conspiracy to commit murder, tampering with evidence. David Degro, 22, was charged as well, though his counts focused on his role in the conspiracy and disposal of the body. First-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, tampering with evidence. Both men were ordered to remain in Tal County Jail, awaiting trial. Meanwhile, Matthew McLaclin's family was left to cope with the devastating truth. Their son hadn't just disappeared. He had been betrayed and murdered by those he trusted most. They launched a GoFundMe to cover costs from the months-long search, keeping hope alive that justice would eventually follow. The case, though gruesome, had finally provided answers. The men responsible were in custody, the locations of the remains known, and investigators could move forward with prosecuting what was a clear case of calculated, cold-blooded murder. But even with arrests and charges, one question remained. Why would someone betray a friend, brother-in-arms, in such a deliberate and merciless way? In the military, brotherhood is everything. It's trust. It's loyalty. It's knowing someone has your back, no matter what. But in this story, trust became a weapon. A fresh start became a death sentence. And when asked if he felt remorse, the answer was chillingly clear: no. What could drive someone to betray a friend, a comrade, a brother? Anger? Control? Ego? Or something darker entirely? If this case left you shaken, don't miss the next one. Subscribe to Minds of Murderers and turn on notifications so you never miss a story of real-life crime, deception, and betrayal. Because sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who calls you brother.